"He can't live here anymore," Tom declared, after he'd clearly twisted everything around. I felt like I was drowning. I was deemed unstable. That night, I left. A week later, eviction papers arrived for them. At 19, I'm trying to navigate life, just like any other person my age. The difference, I suppose, is that I've carried the weight of responsibility since I was practically a baby. When my dad died, I was only 7 years old. Suddenly, childhood became a distant memory. Mom, Sally, was all I had left. For years, it was just us against the world. We had our own kind of messy but beautiful rhythm. We weren't perfect, but we were a team, a unit. I can still picture her ruffling my hair and calling me her little man, which I pretended to find annoying, but secretly loved. Those memories almost feel like they belong to a different life now, a life I barely remember. Everything changed when Tom walked in. Initially, Tom seemed okay, even charming. He was smooth, nice to me when we first met. But it didn't take long to see through the facade. He was manipulative, selfish, and I could see it so clearly, even if no one else could. But my mom, she was completely invested. She convinced herself that she had to hold on to him because he was the only one who would love her. As time went on, I noticed her turning a blind eye to his controlling behavior. He was a master of triangulation. When I wasn't around, I think he'd fill Mom's head with concerns about my supposed attitude problem, or how withdrawn I seemed. So when Mom brought these things up to me, it felt like a sucker punch. What attitude problem? I'd ask, genuinely confused. I've barely even spoken to Tom this week. But the seed of doubt was already planted, blooming in her mind. As time went on, Tom's tactics became almost laughably obvious, to me anyway. He'd volunteer to pick me up from school, then conveniently forget until I'd been waiting for what felt like an eternity. When I finally got home, frustrated and exhausted, he'd be there with Mom, offering some flimsy excuse about me getting the times wrong. "Chris has been so forgetful lately," he'd remark, always with that carefully crafted look of concern etched on his face. "Perhaps we should consider getting him checked for ADHD." And Mom would glance at me, her expression a complex blend of worry and disappointment that invariably tied my stomach in knots. The worst part, though, was witnessing how effortlessly he manipulated my mom. Sally, my mom, had always possessed this quiet, inner strength. After my father passed away, she became the bedrock of our family, holding everything together even as she was secretly crumbling inside. But Tom, with his predatory intuition, knew precisely how to exploit her insecurities. He would shower her with praise for the most insignificant things. "Sally, you're such an amazing cook. I've genuinely never encountered a woman who could make hamburger helper taste like it came from a gourmet restaurant," he'd say, subtly fostering her dependence on his validation. Then, completely unpredictably, he'd abruptly withdraw that praise, leaving her desperately trying to decipher what transgression she had committed. "You know I love you, Sally," he'd declare with practiced sincerity when she dared to question his behavior, "but sometimes you're just overly sensitive." That's not at all what I meant. Classic gaslighting, plain and simple. I had witnessed this pattern often enough to recognize it for what it was, but Mom was entangled too deeply in his manipulative web to see the truth for herself. Then Lindsay arrived, Tom's daughter from a previous relationship. She moved in with us approximately a year after Tom and Mom exchanged vows. At 16, she embodied everything I wasn't: brash, demanding, and utterly convinced of her own entitlement. She would erupt in temper tantrums over the smallest of inconveniences, yet Tom treated her as if she were a delicate princess in perpetual need of his protection and pampering. The methodical way in which Tom turned everyone against me was truly insidious. He began with my own mother, then Lindsay, and gradually extended his campaign to include extended family and even our neighbors. He would fabricate slightly altered versions of stories, tailored for each individual, carefully constructing this fragmented narrative where I was increasingly portrayed as troubled, ungrateful, and generally disruptive. To our next-door neighbor, I was a troublemaker who frequently stayed out too late, presumably engaging in nefarious activities. To my mother's sister, I was simply going through a phase and causing my poor mother undue grief. By the time I reached 18, I felt as if I were trapped inside some warped, nightmarish alternate reality. The story that everyone believed about me bore absolutely no resemblance to who I actually was. I was still enrolled in honors classes, diligently working part-time at the local grocery store to earn my own money, and had never even received a single detention. Yet somehow, within Tom's carefully crafted narrative, I had become this disruptive, potentially dangerous presence within the very walls of my own home. The breaking point occurred on a seemingly ordinary Thursday night. We were gathered for dinner, one of Tom's mandatory family dinners, during which he would relentlessly interrogate me about the details of my day, barely allowing me to interject a single word. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Lindsay, wearing this smug, poorly calculated smirk, dropped her bombshell. "Dad," Lindsay cooed, all sweetness and light, "Chris made me feel really uncomfortable earlier." My breath caught in my throat, water threatening to spill down my front. Just hours before, I'd been cornered in the kitchen by Lindsay. The memory alone made my skin crawl. While everyone else was out, she'd pressed herself against me, whispering some nonsense about us not really being related and suggesting something happening between us wouldn't be that strange. It was repulsive, a blatant violation of my space. I'd shoved her away, gently, just enough to put some distance between us, and told her, firmly, to back off. She'd stomped off, slamming doors with her usual dramatic flair when she didn't get her way. Now, sitting at dinner, she was twisting the entire scenario, turning me into the aggressor. She was spinning a web of lies, and I was caught right in the center. Judging by the look that flashed across Tom's face, I knew he'd been waiting, anticipating, for an opportunity just like this. "Listen," Tom said, turning toward Mom with practiced concern dripping from his voice, "he's 18 now. He's a burden, really. We can't keep him living here any longer." I don't know," Mom replied, her voice barely audible, weak and wavering. "Maybe it's time." Her words landed like a physical blow, a punch to the gut. My own mother, the woman I had supported, comforted, and cared for through the worst days after Dad passed, was actually considering throwing me out based on a blatant, disgusting lie. She wouldn't even meet my gaze, her eyes darting around the room, anywhere but at me. I pushed back my chair, the legs scraping against the floor, my own legs suddenly shaky and unstable. "Seriously? You're really going to let him do this?" I challenged, directing my question at her. The heavy silence that followed was all the answer I needed. She had made her choice, and it wasn't me. That night felt surreal, like an out-of-body experience. I packed what little I could fit, just 2 suitcases of clothes, my laptop, my lifeline to the outside world, and the few remaining photos I had of Dad that Tom hadn't managed to conveniently lose. I didn't have a plan, not really, just a desperate, overwhelming need to escape that toxic, suffocating environment before I completely lost myself within Tom's twisted, manipulative reality. I called Uncle Jack, my dad's brother. We weren't particularly close, Tom had seen to that, constantly poisoning Mom's ear with claims that Jack was a bad influence who enabled my attitude problems. Still, he was the only person I could think of who might possibly understand what I was going through. He picked me up without hesitation, without even asking for details until we were safely inside his small apartment. But even after I'd physically escaped, Tom's control didn't end. He was determined to make me pay for defying him. Within days, he was spreading malicious rumors and stories throughout the neighborhood. To some, he claimed I'd stolen money from them, concocting elaborate tales of my deceit. To others, he subtly hinted at violent tendencies, painting me as unstable and dangerous. He even contacted my workplace, expressing fabricated concerns to my manager about my reliability, my attendance, and my overall performance, nearly costing me my job. It was as if he couldn't stand the idea that I'd broken free from his grasp, so he was determined to systematically destroy whatever independent life I might try to build for myself. He launched a campaign, contacting distant relatives, old family friends, even that counselor from high school I barely remembered. Each time, he'd spin a different version of the same twisted lie, that I was unstable, potentially dangerous, and had abandoned my poor, long-suffering mother who had supposedly done everything for me. Some people, those who barely knew me, swallowed it whole. Mrs. Henderson, who used to bake me cookies when I was a kid, now pointedly crossed the street whenever she saw me. Liam's parents, my best friend, suddenly decided he wasn't allowed to hang out with me anymore. Even Mom's parents, my own grandparents, sent me this coldly formal email lecturing me about respecting my mother and giving Tom a chance. The hypocrisy stung worse than I could have imagined. There were days when I looked in the mirror and genuinely questioned myself. Was I truly the problem? Was I, deep down, this violent, ungrateful, selfish creature he'd painted me to be for everyone else? Logically, I knew it wasn't true, but his words wormed their way into my head anyway, like some insidious weed choking out any peace. Then came the phone call that cut through the fog. I was at work, meticulously stacking organic apples at the grocery store, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Uncle Jack almost never called during my shifts, so I instantly knew something was wrong. I ducked into the back room to answer. "Chris, you need to come home as soon as you can," he said, his voice unusually tight. "There's something you need to see, something important." The rest of my shift was a blur of distraction. I nearly sent a tower of cantaloupes crashing to the floor as my mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Had something happened to Mom? Had Tom escalated his campaign of lies? By the time I pulled into Uncle Jack's driveway, my stomach was a tangled mess of knots. Jack was waiting for me at the kitchen table, an old leather folder open in front of him. He looked up when I walked in, and his expression was unreadable. A mixture of anger, disbelief, and something that almost looked like triumph flickered across his face. "Sit down, kid," he said, pushing the folder toward me. "I was clearing out some old files, and I found something that should have been given to you a long time ago. A very long time ago." I hesitantly sat down, pulling the worn folder closer. Inside was a stack of legal documents, the kind with official seals and fancy signatures at the bottom. The paper felt heavy and strangely significant in my hands. As I began to read, the legal jargon swam before my eyes, an alphabet soup of confusion until I caught a familiar address, our home address, followed by my name. "What is this?" I asked, although a part of me already knew, a slow, dawning realization creeping through my veins as I scanned the document. "Your father's will," Jack said, his voice softer now, almost remorseful. "Your dad left the house to you, Chris. Not to Sally, not to be shared, not to anyone else. To you, directly. He set it up in a trust that you'd gain control of when you turned 18. I was supposed to be the executor, but after your dad died," he trailed off, running a hand wearily over his face, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. "Sally was in such a fragile state, I just couldn't bring myself to add to her burden at that moment. And as the years drifted by, a part of me simply assumed she knew the truth about it all, that she was keeping it secret, holding it safe, until I reached adulthood." I stared fixedly at the document in my hands, Dad's signature at the very bottom suddenly the only thing I could truly focus on. "The house where Mom and Tom are currently living, it's actually mine. All this time, this information had been withheld from me." Jack nodded slowly, his expression grim and solemn. "Legally, yes. Ever since your 18th birthday, which was 4 months ago now, that house has legally belonged to you and you alone. Not Tom. Not even your mom. It belongs to you." A wave of dizziness washed over me, leaving me feeling lightheaded and unwell, like I was on the verge of fainting, or maybe even throwing up, or perhaps doing both simultaneously. This was so much more than just feeling like some unwanted kid being pushed out of her childhood home. I was the rightful owner, being manipulated and effectively forced out of my own property, my own birthright. All those renovations Tom had enthusiastically undertaken, all the deliberate ways he'd systematically erased Dad's presence from the house, he'd been doing it all in a house that wasn't even legally his to begin with. Does Mom even know? I finally managed to choke out, though I strongly suspected deep down that I already knew the answer to my own question. Jack's expression clouded over, turning even darker. She almost certainly has to know. Her signature is also on these very documents. She signed as a witness to the fact. And I also mentioned the existence of this document to her once, many years ago, long before Tom was even in the picture. She dismissed it at the time, brushed it off, and just said we'd figure it all out when the time came. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I found myself constantly picturing Tom strutting around my father's house, my house, acting like he owned the entire place, callously throwing away Dad's cherished things, even going so far as to cut down our old tree, somehow managing to manipulate my mother into actually believing that I was the intruder, when all along, he was the one who fundamentally didn't belong there. By morning, however, a strange and unexpected calm had settled over me, replacing the burning anger that had been coursing through me all night long. For months and months, I'd felt utterly powerless, standing by helplessly, watching Tom systematically dismantle and take apart my entire life. But now I suddenly had leverage, I possessed real power. I had the truth. And I also had the full force and weight of the law squarely on my side. I spoke to Jack about this over breakfast, carefully laying out my plans, clearly explaining exactly what I wanted to do. He listened attentively without interrupting me even once, then finally nodded slowly and thoughtfully when I had finished speaking. It definitely won't be easy, he cautioned me gently. Tom won't go quietly or peacefully. And your mom, this could potentially be the final breaking point between the two of you. Are you truly prepared for that eventuality? Was I really? I thought back to all those countless times Mom had just stood there silently, passively, while Tom belittled me, making me feel small and insignificant. The memories stung. All those times she sided with him, dismissing my truth. That hesitation at dinner when Lindsay spun her lies, as if she genuinely doubted me, her own daughter. And letting Tom, that parasite, erase every trace of my father from our home without a word. Yes, I finally said, a resolve hardening within me. I'm ready. That afternoon, the lawyer Jack recommended laid out my reality with stark clarity. As he examined the documents, his expression darkened with each page he turned. This is quite clear-cut, he stated when he was finished. The house is undeniably yours. Your mother has been living there as a tenant, essentially, since you came of age, though I doubt she sees it that way. We can proceed with eviction immediately. And Tom? I asked, a knot of apprehension twisting in my stomach. His smile was devoid of warmth. Your stepfather has no legal claim whatsoever. He isn't named on the deed, the will, nothing. Legally, he is simply a guest who has far exceeded his welcome. We spent the next hour dissecting the options before me. I could demand immediate eviction, granting them the bare minimum legal notice, a mere 3 days in this state. Or, I could offer a more extended time frame as a gesture of civility, though a part of me balked at the idea. I could even propose a rental agreement, retaining ownership while allowing them to remain, but the thought made my skin crawl. That night, summoning every ounce of courage, I sent Mom a text, concise and unwavering, you have 1 week to vacate the house. I know the truth about Dad's will. My heart hammered in my chest, the pulse throbbing in my fingertips as I hit send. The unknown stretched before me, but I was certain, absolutely certain, that it couldn't be more agonizing than the years I'd already endured. I braced myself for the fallout. It arrived with the force of a hurricane, almost instantaneously. First, a phone call I deliberately ignored, letting it ring through to voicemail. Then, a relentless barrage of texts from Mom, a volatile mix of bewilderment, denial, and blatant manipulation. What are you talking about? Read the first message, dripping with false innocence. This isn't a joke, Chris. Please call me back. We need to discuss this. Then came the guilt trip, sharp and calculated. You can't just throw your family out onto the street, after everything I've done for you. Is this how you repay me? I remained silent, refusing to engage. I couldn't answer. The second I heard her voice, the minute I engaged in any sort of conversation, I knew I'd crumble. All my carefully constructed resolve would shatter, and I'd be back to questioning myself, second-guessing every decision. So, I silenced my phone and forced my attention onto my textbook, though the words swam on the page, refusing to form coherent sentences. Then a text pinged through from an unknown number. Tom. You ungrateful little, expletive. Your mother is in tears. Is that what you wanted? To hurt her more than you already have? My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a furious storm brewing inside me. I typed and deleted at least a dozen responses, each one sharper and angrier than the last. In the end, I blocked the number. This wasn't about inflicting pain on Mom. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, what Dad always intended for me to inherit. The next morning, as I was heading to class, I found Lindsay waiting by my car. She looked diminished, somehow, less sure of herself without Tom and Mom bolstering her. You can't do this, she pleaded, her voice unusually flat, lacking its usual bite. Where are we supposed to go? A wave of guilt washed over me. Lindsay, despite everything, was still just a child caught in the crossfire of adult battles. But then I remembered the lies she'd told, how she'd eagerly participated in Tom's manipulative plot to force me out. That's not my concern, I replied, brushing past her to unlock the car door. You have a week. I suggest you start packing your things immediately. She trailed after me, grabbing my arm. What if I told everyone the truth? What if I confessed that I lied that night at dinner? Would you let us stay then? I stared at her, momentarily speechless at the sudden admission. A part of me desperately wanted to say yes, to seize this opportunity to finally clear my name, to prove my innocence. But another, more realistic part of me knew it wouldn't truly change anything. Tom would simply find another angle, another way to twist the narrative and paint me as the villain. It's far too late for that, I said softly, gently disengaging her hand from my arm. This house is mine. It always should have been. That's the only truth that matters now, I muttered to myself, trying to solidify my resolve. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing alone in the street. A fleeting pang of something akin to pity shot through me. But then the memory flooded back, her face at that dinner, the deliberate coldness in her eyes as she delivered her lies. Any tenderness I might have felt instantly dissolved. The following week crawled by, each day an eternity, yet the whole period felt like a disorienting blur. I threw myself into work and my studies, desperately trying to block out the turmoil unfolding at the house, my house. I had already delivered the eviction notice to my lawyer, who had served it. Mom, of course, called Jack in a frenzy, but he remained steadfast, asserting that this situation was solely between her and me. On the day of the eviction, my focus was completely shattered. I found myself constantly checking my phone, half expecting another onslaught of angry texts from Mom, but there was only silence. The stillness was somehow even more unsettling than the screaming matches we'd had before. It was my lawyer, Michael, who finally called late in the afternoon. They're gone, he stated simply. The locksmith is changing the locks now. Do you want to come see the property? The property, my childhood home, reduced to a clinical, legal term. I drove there in a kind of daze, unsure of what I would encounter. Had they vandalized the place out of spite? Had Mom stripped it bare, leaving me with nothing but empty rooms? As I turned into the driveway, I was struck by the house's unassuming exterior, the same faded blue paint, the same slightly unruly hedges. If I squinted, I could almost pretend it was still the same house from my youth, before Tom entered our lives, before everything started to unravel. Michael greeted me at the front door, handing me a set of keys. It's all yours, he said. They took their personal belongings, but they left the furniture behind. It's standard in these situations. I nodded, almost numbly, taking the keys. They felt heavy in my hand, a tangible representation of the mixed feelings of victory and loss. The emotional fallout was severe. Although I had regained possession of my house, although I had finally evicted Tom, it didn't truly feel like a victory. My mother's letter continued to haunt me. I would take it out again and again, rereading it, wondering if there was any possibility of salvaging our relationship, of stepping back from the cliff we'd found ourselves teetering on. Could I ever truly forgive her? And, even more importantly, should I? I still struggled to make my mother understand that I wasn't the villain in our story. Perhaps she was beginning to see her own mistakes, maybe even acknowledging Tom's manipulation, but a part of her remained convinced by his lies. She seemed to believe I was selfish, ungrateful, the daughter who had callously tossed her mother out of her own home. The sting of that misconception ran deeper than I'd anticipated. In moments of despair, I'd find myself questioning everything, wondering if I could have acted differently, if I should have just caved. But then the truth would resurface: this wasn't about me. This was about Tom's ability to twist and control, turning her against me, and finally, me finding the courage to defend myself, to reclaim what was rightfully mine, what my father had always intended for me. The following weeks were dedicated to reclaiming the house, slowly making it mine again. I repainted my bedroom in a shade of calming blue, hung up prints that reflected my own personality, and invested in furniture that appealed to my aesthetic, a stark contrast to Tom's austere taste. I even planted a new maple tree in the backyard, choosing the exact spot where the one my dad and I had planted years ago had once stood. It felt symbolic, a rebirth of sorts. Tom, predictably, didn't concede defeat easily. He attempted to challenge the eviction, alleging that he'd made significant improvements to the property, thereby increasing its market value. His lawyer bombarded me with threatening letters, demanding compensation for these so-called enhancements. My lawyer, Michael, handled it all with a quiet, professional expertise, dismantling each claim with the precision it deserved. He has absolutely no legal basis for this, Michael assured me. He knew he had no legal claim to that property. The fact that he's even trying to fight it just underscores his sense of entitlement to something that was never his. Eventually, the threats diminished and ceased. Tom and Lindsay relocated to another state. I heard through a mutual acquaintance from high school that he'd secured a new job, a fresh start. A sliver of me wondered if he would find another vulnerable woman to manipulate, another family to tear apart. But I couldn't dwell on that. It wasn't my concern anymore. As for Mom, we're not the same as we were before. I'm not even sure if we ever will be. But she calls me occasionally now, and I've started answering. We engage in polite conversations, sticking to safe topics like the weather, my studies, and her new position at a different medical facility. We carefully avoid any mention of Tom, or the house, or the deeply painful events of the recent past. It's a fragile, tentative peace, but it's something. I can't predict what the future holds. On some days, the house still feels overwhelmingly empty, haunted by echoes of what was. On others, I feel a quiet sense of accomplishment, a deep satisfaction in having reclaimed my life, in having stood up to the man who attempted to erase my existence. What I do know, with absolute certainty, is this: I am not the person Tom tried to convince me I was. I possess a strength I didn't realize I had, a resilience that I'd underestimated. Perhaps, deep down, my father understood all of this. It feels like the house wasn't simply a place for me to reside, it was a deliberate gift, a legacy loaded with meaning. Now, living here, I see it as a constant, tangible prompt, that I am entitled to defend my space, to champion the things I believe in, and to carve out a life that authentically reflects who I am. It's a daunting prospect, certainly, but the house stands as a solid, reassuring presence, reminding me that I possess the strength to do just that. His absence is still a sharp ache, but this inheritance feels like a whisper of encouragement, urging me forward.